everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Big Life. I was going to start counting and then I have lost count. So, season 2, episode something. Jordyn and I are back from multiple countries. Jordyn, you're in Canada. What's going on?
I am in Montreal visiting a teammate. And yeah, I mean, it was so good. We had to extend our trip. I was supposed to be home Sunday. Now I'm not leaving until Tuesday. So, I mean, I'm having the time of my life. My teammate, Soph Beersworth, I think is the best planner ever. Like, I don't even know if there's anything left to do after we leave here. Like, we have checked all the boxes. It's really weird, though, because it's like everyone speaks French. Like, the main language is French. Everyone speaks English, too. But, like, we went to soccer practice with her the other day, and, like, all the rules, instructions, everyone's yelling at each other in French. And we're just kind of, like, standing there, like, who knows what's going on? I felt like you. I can understand.
Like, so welcome to every single day of my life.
I have no idea how you do it. Like, I went for one practice and I'm like, just my heart rate was like tripled from what it normally is. I'm like, I don't know what's going on.
Yeah, you get used to the extra mental exhaustion that does come from the constant translating and understanding. But yeah, it's definitely a different animal sometimes, but it's worth it.
Yeah, I'm trying to learn a little bit. We've gotten the basics. I can ask where the toilet is and say hi, you're welcome, and that's about it. So
that's the most needed things. So
right?
You're doing fine, especially for a week. So happy for you.
Thank you.
All right. And yes, things are going down good in Stockholm. We're in Sweden over here. We are currently sitting at 4th on the table, which is super exciting for the club. And we got another win on the road this week. And so, yeah, it's been a big week. Somehow, we teased it last week. I did go to Taylor Swift yesterday, Stockholm, night 3. Trey and I ended up on the barricade. So front row, Taylor Swift in Stockholm. There was a lot of emotions that happened last night.
I saw you guys posting and it looked like you could literally touch her.
Yeah, we could. Like, I felt cool. Taylor Swift's sweat like come down on me.
That is insane. I mean, like, how did you considering it was such a last minute decision, you're like, maybe I'll go to a Taylor Swift concert, and then you're right there?
Yeah, like, okay, I would like to preface this. I love Taylor Swift. I'm a very big Taylor Swift fan. I wouldn't say I'm a full-on Swiftie. Like, that's a whole nother like degree. Love them, like, that's great. But like, I've never self-categorized. So it was like last minute, we're like, let's go to Taylor Swift. It's once in a lifetime. And we literally just won the bingo or the lottery of StubHub. So like when we bought the tickets, like they're not allowed to add like extra information. So it's just general admission standing. So like, yeah, we'll stand, like we're athletic, whatever. We just want the cheapest seats. And in Europe, the cheapest seats are like the standing ones. So we're like, dope. We get the tickets back. They're VIP tickets. And we were like, oh. So we didn't know that. So we didn't get any of the other VIP perks, but we got the early access, which is what we wanted. So we got into the arena an hour before like the general admission did. So people who were like lined up starting at like 3 a.m. like they were doing for general admission, like we got in before them. So then we got even luckier because I live in North Shipping, which is by the time you take public transportation, it's 2.5 hours to get to Stockholm. So we were like, I had a game the night before. We had come in from a road trip. Like we weren't trying to camp out. Whatever we were getting, we were lucky with getting, especially with the price we paid for these things. Like we did not break the bank. So then we get there and we find out that Sweden did something like really weird. We don't know if it was like on accident or not, but like there's VIP left and VIP right. And there's like 2,000 VIP tickets. Instead of doing like 1,000 and 1,000, Stockholm did like 1,600 on the right and 400 on the left. And we were lucky enough to be on the left. So by getting to the concert at like 1:30 for the concert that started at 6:15, we were the 50th person let into the arena on the left side. So I don't know, like who, like karma, someone was looking out for us, but yeah, we had amazing seats for Taylor Swift that we just completely lucked into.
Oh my God. That is like, then I don't even understand like how lucky you are right now. Like
I think I need to get like a lottery ticket. Like I need to do everything right now because something's working my way.
Definitely. You need to like, yes, hit the casino, go bet on some horses. I don't even know. Do it all. Did Trey end up wearing the Karma shirt?
He did not wear the Karma shirt. It's been a big debacle in our apartment right now, but he had the time of his life. So we'll take it as a win. We'll take it as a win. Well, enough about my extremely lucky Taylor Swift that I just kind of had to rub into everyone's faces. We have an amazing guest on this week's podcast episode, and honestly, one that I was so grateful we got to talk to because I felt like it applied to a lot of my life right now. And it really hit home in a lot of spaces. And Jordyn, I know you were able to bring this guy on. So just talk a bit about what he does with your team before we go into the interview.
Yeah, yeah. Our team is lucky enough to be able to work very closely with Dr. Nick Holton. He is kind of like our go-to person for being able to learn and improve our mental aspect of the game. He goes and he has a program called the Anti-Fragile Academy, Anti-Fragile Athlete, and we go and we have a program with him, and he'll come in and he'll do in-person lessons, and he'll answer questions with you and do one-on-one interviews if you need. And he's just kind of like our go-to guy for improving the mental aspect of the game, and it's been huge for us, talked about more and more as the game of soccer is growing and becoming more popular. Mental health is becoming more of a conversation, and just really acknowledging the mental aspect of the game and being able to learn and grow and utilize that because it is such a large part has been huge. And yeah, we're very, very lucky to work very closely with them.
Yeah, I think one of the coolest parts about this is Nick will say it himself in the interview. He's not a sports psychologist. He's not who will you go to get one-on-one clinical therapy. However, he specializes in sport performance. And there's such a thin gray line between those two balances of area. But to really go into the sports performance aspect and how mentality and all these things are derived from and come on the field, I thought it was a super, super unique conversation that I was so excited to have. And I can't wait to bring to all of our listeners.
Absolutely. And I mean, nobody's going to be able to introduce him better than himself and what he has in the website. So, I mean, I'm just going to read his bio for who he is, essentially. So, Dr. Nick Holton is an international speaker, consultant, trainer, and coach. His work focuses on helping individuals become better versions of themselves through the application of the cutting edge science of human flourishing, a synergistic development of both peak performance and overall well being and fulfillment. He works with individuals, teams, businesses, and organizations ranging from professional athletes, NCAA programs, educational institutions, first responders, and Fortune 100 executives. He also co-hosts the podcast Flourish FM, which is sponsored by the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard and the Department of Education at Oxford. Nick has worked with clients, given talks, and delivered trainings across the US, Europe, India, Australia, Uganda, Singapore, Mexico, and South America. So
absolutely amazing. So excited to have this guy on. What a guy to bring on the podcast. So everyone, without further ado, Dr. Nick Holton.
All right. Thank you very much. We have Nick Holton here. Dr. Nick Holton, or as we like to call him on my team, Skeets. Works very closely with our team, sports psychologist and good friend of Jeff's. So we get the privilege of seeing him here and working with him. So Nick is a sports psychologist. And we get a lot of questions all the time about how the mental game goes hand in hand with the physical game, especially with women's soccer, which this podcast is, mainly about. So can you give us just a little bit of background on your journey and how you got here and, what you kind of do?
Sure. Yeah. Well, first and foremost, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here. My privilege to be here. And thanks for sharing my middle name. You have the privilege of being able to call me that since you're friends with a friend or play for a friend. Yeah, so like the long and short of how and why I got to this place is, I mean, I can go all the way back to like even sixth grade and helping I was a pretty good soccer player. You mentioned a lot of the audiences kind of maybe soccer oriented, but not exclusive. And I could have played college, I played high level club, that sort of thing. So just helping my sister one day, kind of learn a few things here and there. She went out, had this great game. And I just remember my takeaway being, oh, I did that, right? I created sort of that change. And that felt good, right? Not necessarily in a selfish way, although when I say it like that, it sounds selfish. But it was like, oh, I can take something that I like and am pretty good at and can use it to help somebody else feel better, right? Like experience some sort of like pleasant emotion. Like, okay, cool. So fast forward, that eventually led me into education and classrooms, but neither of you are that far removed from academia and certainly not from high school. And so, like that experience isn't always a super positive or pleasant one or one that really develops our best potentials. And I say that as a longtime teacher. So I eventually went back to get a doctoral degree, and that's where I discovered things like well-being sciences, resilience, flow, peak performance states, essentially the psychology and the neuroscience of what helps us feel our best, perform our best, and do hard shit, right? And all three of those things are going to play really, really important roles in life in general, right? And certainly for this audience, sports specifically, and we can talk about, sports at that granular way, but these are ultimately life skills. Again, how do I generally feel good and build stuff into life that makes life worth living and raises the quality of it? How do I do hard shit so that life is rich and that I grow and develop into my best self, even if it doesn't feel pleasant along the way? That's an important dynamic. And then how do I kind of, day to day, week to week, perform, not necessarily always perfectly or optimally, but perform well or perform at a sort of like minimum floor level in the things that I care about, not just my sport, but in my relationships and in the classroom or my professional life or whatever it might be, right? So that's kind of it in a nutshell.
So as you go through this, you are the co-founder of the Anti-Fragile Academy. Can you tell us a little bit about what that is?
Yeah, so the way, right, I just laid out three things. So let's call it well-being, build the good, resilience, navigate the bad or the unpleasant, more specifically, and then performance. So we would make the argument that if you're building up all three of those capacities, strategically building the good, right, learning skills to help you navigate and use the bad, and then learning strategies to help you perform well consistently, then you're building up a capacity for anti-fragility. Now, what is anti-fragility? We always tell this story with two famous characters from Greek mythology, the Phoenix and the Hydra. So the Phoenix, right, and not knowing the age of your audience, but if you want to, Harry Potter fans, right, Phoenix bursts into flames, right, falls to ashes, and then it can be reborn essentially like as its same self. Okay, that's resilience. It's navigating and returning more or less to kind of the similar thing we were before adversity. But the Hydra was this multi-headed sort of serpent-like creature, right? And if you would slice off one of its heads, it would grow back two more. That's anti-fragility, right? So what we're talking about doing is trying to help athletes and parents and coaches proactively, right, build up a capacity for robustness, for anti-fragility, to take on the hard shit that life throws at us and be able to use it, be able to learn from it, to be able to grow from it, so that when adversity inevitably does strike, that capacity is built in. We can still maintain certain levels of performance and grow from it. But it's not just about the adversity. The moments in between, you're also developing skills that help you make and build a life worth living, right? So it's this really integrated approach. Anti-fragile sounds like mental toughness and, like rigidity and, I can't feel anything. And I think, Joe, you can speak to this having gone through some of our stuff for the last couple of years. It's not like that at all. We're really trying to focus on the entire human being because we think that's really the only way to do it. And you asked the question right at the start, Joe, the connection between mind and body, and you hear us say bio, psycho, social all the time. You got to be thinking top down or the brain, bottom up or the mind body connection, and then outside in the relationships, the environment, those sorts of things when you consider an entire human being, right?
So all I'm hearing out of this is that you're definitely a Slytherin. I mean, with like talking about the
Yeah,
high.
yeah.
It's happened to Harry Potter. Okay.
Understandably, I can see why you get that impression. Yeah, everything I said sounds very villainous, doesn't it?
So in all seriousness, like Jordyn said, so much of our audience, and I think Jordyn and I navigating the highs and lows of athletics in general itself, know how important this mental side of the game is. And it's being talked about more and more, which is incredible. At what age do you personally feel like this mental game really needs to start being a factor in our athletic development?
Needs to is a tricky question. Can start, depends on the individual. Later today, I'm working with a 10-year-old, right? She's a pretty high level tennis player and the language is very different. right? But the ideas are very much the same, right? This little girl still succumbs to ideas like the negativity bias. Her mistakes stick out to her more than her successes. So, you can start to learn, I think, at a very young age, how to kind of pick out different aspects of a reality to just help challenge catastrophic thinking, right? And just these like really overtly negative cycles. Most of our programming starts right around kind of first year of high school, somewhere in that 14, 15 age range. But that's really for no reason other than that's what we think the content speaks to, right? The most in terms of our expertise. We're not traditionally working with age groups much lower than that, at least on the psychological level. But again, if a young person can understand some of these concepts, or you can find a coach or a program that packages these concepts in really accessible language, like anything, I don't think it's ever too early to start learning, because when we're young, that's when the brain is most plastic, most malleable, right? I'd argue those are the times to try to get these in. Now, your age group as well, right? The brain doesn't stop developing until 25. That's when adolescence technically ends. But generally, I would say the younger, the better, if that young person is at a level where they're capable of taking in, such information and skills.
So I think I kind of know your opinion on this, but I want to ask because I thought it was really interesting. We hear a lot about the 90-10%, with 90% of the game being mental and 10% being the physical aspects of the soccer. What are your thoughts on this?
So, the phrase that we like to use, and you'll hear this out, popular podcasts, 100% nervous system. Okay. So I understand the sentiment behind what you just shared, which I think is saying, listen, some of it is the way you move and the physical gifts on the field. And the other is, I don't know, tactical prep, film review, right? Pre-game routine, discipline in the off hours, discipline around meals. Like you could argue a lot of that is quote unquote mental, right? The truth of the matter is, there's no cutoff point anywhere on the body where it's like, okay, now this is the head up, right? This is all 100% nervous system. The mind or brain, if you will, and the body are one. And so when we look at things like the simplest example is this. So any listener who has ever had to perform or show up to school or work or parent or whatever on little to no sleep, and all of a sudden, like you're irritable, you're crying for no reason, right? Like you're snapping at people, you're trying to make sure you don't nod off, you're reading a simple email 4 or 5 times, right? Like anyone I think can relate to that. And that's just a simple example. You don't dial in the body, the brain is not going to function well. And listen to everything I just listed off. A lack of focus, lack of what we call discipline or self-regulation, lack of motivation, lack of emotion regulation, right? And that's just from poor sleep. So if, again, I understand the sentiment, physical versus what I need to think about, but the truth of the matter is if you're not taking a lens of 100% nervous system, 100% me, you're leaving juice from that squeeze, right? You're leaving potential on the table.
Yeah, I was thinking really interesting when you brought it up in there because that's a quote that gets thrown a lot and you hear a lot is the 90-10%. And when you say that, it does feel very, very different, right? And when you say 90-10, it feels like it's a mindset rather than taking into account everything you're doing off the field for preparation, like the sleep, the nutrition, all of those aspects that it ties together and it's all one thing. I always thought that was really interesting and I had never really thought of it that way.
No, I think that's great. You've worked with athletes for a long time now, and I'm sure at this point you can almost see the things before an athlete almost does when they start talking about you. What are some of the most common struggles that athletes may come to you with, especially around this high school, starting college game phase?
Yeah, I just said it. The negativity bias is it's number one, easy, far and away, especially the transition from, say, senior year to collegiate soccer. Because unless you are like 1% of the 1%, right? And Sam, I'm not as familiar with your game. Joe, I think you actually had elements of this, so maybe you can speak to it. But I think for most people, you show up and you have been for your entire life the best player on your team. And then within a week or two, you might be the worst. You might be worried about cracking, the starting 11. right? You start to all of a sudden see more mistakes maybe than you do successes, where it was always way more successes than mistakes. But the negativity bias is just, it's an evolutionary mechanism. It's a survival instinct. The basic idea is unpleasant stuff is stickier than pleasant stuff. Okay. So you are more likely to spend more time and attention on the one pass you miss in a game, or, Sam, I don't know what position you play, but like Joe rocks the crossbar, right? On a shot that could have been the go-ahead goal. She might be spending the next week thinking about that. She might be focused on that in her training, right? In her personal time, right? Those sorts of things. And to some extent, that's okay, because in that case, that would drive some of Joe's desire to refine and improve, right? And grow from there. But the bias can kind of get nasty when it causes us to ruminate, get down on ourselves, get to a point of anxiousness, and become rigid and tight, which again is why this is 100% nervous system, right? The body responds when the brain starts to freak the F out. And sometimes vice versa. It doesn't always happen in that direction, right? But my point here is, like, you asked about one. So if we can understand the negativity bias, identify it, label it, and we teach different skills and mechanisms to kind of make it malleable, right? And play around with it, then you can insert ways to calm the body slightly and get into a zone you need to for peak performance, which is pliable and flexible and Gumby-like, not rigid, right? But I'll just say too, just because Joe, you asked about the 100% piece, like it can work in the other direction, where sometimes you notice a racing heart or sweaty palms or hair on the back of your neck, and the body reacts to that negativity first, and you might have to initiate breath work or stretching or distraction, right? Just to get enough blood flow up here to do that reframing work to combat the negativity bias. So again, to that question of 100% nervous system, it can happen in both directions, right? But negativity bias, I think, is the most obvious answer, just overly focused on and almost handicapped by unpleasant experience.
You mentioned kind of the line between letting your failures motivate you versus letting them consume you to the point where it's detrimental. How do you toe that line? How do you figure out when you need to lock in and focus and really, do these things? And how do you know when it's becoming detrimental to your game?
Yeah. So I think it's helpful to maybe not to be overly nerdy, but to distinguish some language here. A couple of weeks ago, you mentioned in the intro that I do a podcast through the Human Flourishing program at Harvard. And so we have on these really amazing researchers from around the world that talk about different topics. And one of them is Harvard Business School's Amy Edmondson, who's a global top thinker in the world of business and organizational psychology. And she's got a new book called The Right Kind of Wrong. And she distinguishes between failure and mistakes. And I think that's really, really helpful in this situation and to your question, Joe. So a mistake, right, might be when we have the requisite skills, information, experience, whatever it might be, and we fumble it away or screw it up anyway, right? Whereas failure, right, might be that we do not have the requisite sort of skills or competencies or whatever it might be, right? And so there's an important distinction there between mistake and failure. So for instance, if, Sam, if you did film prep, right, coming into, say, Big Ten tournament, right, or NCAA tournament, something like that, and what position did you play, Sam?
Outside back.
Out, perfect, right. So you and Joe are squaring off on each other.
Oh yeah, there's plenty of film on it. If you want to go back and watch it, there's plenty of it.
Perfect, right? And so, I've watched Joe enough, that she's not a selfish player, but she wants to skin you. She wants to make you look silly if she has the possibility. So if she brings the ball down to her feet, she's probably going to go one-on-one. You need to be ready for it. Instead, you came in hard charging at her. She spun you easily and was off to the races, ends up sliding in a pass for the goal. Sorry, Sam, but I'm Michigan State grad. Go green. Right?
I was like, I'm going in.
So that is a mistake, right? You had the information. You knew Joe's tendencies. You knew what you were supposed to do, and you didn't do it anyway, right? In that case, back to your question, Joe, there should be some unpleasantness. There should be some learning from that, right? And if you repeat that time and time again, eventually, Sam, Dave is going to look at you like, what the hell is going on, right? You're doing it over and over again. Failure would be like not having that information, right? Not knowing Joe's tendencies coming in, and okay, you failed to kind of win that one-on-one battle, but it wasn't because you made quote unquote mistakes. It's just you weren't armed with the information to begin with, right? So part of, I think, learning from failure is first identifying, did I fail because of something I lack, or did I have everything I needed and I screwed it up anyway? One's a mistake, one is failure, and the failure part just means get more skills, get more experience, get more information, keep growing. But if it's mistakes because I keep doing the same shit over and over again, we got a different problem. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I think I'm in a bit of shock right now. These are like literally conversations I feel like I'm having as a player who's played in the US, played in college, and now is shifting to a European style. My coaches are telling me, like, you play too American, like, we need you to shift like this. And I'm like coming home and I'm like, what do you mean I play like too American? Like, what mistakes am I making? But my mom's like, you don't know any better. Like, you're learning. And so this is exactly the time. I'm like, I could like channel this one. Last episode was for you, Joe. This one's my own little break right now. So this all being said, you know, there's so many different times as an athlete where we either have those good performances or those bad performances. And I know for me, when I'm at my best, when I'm feeling it, I call it my autopilot mode, or what a lot of people call like your flow zone. And as an athlete, it's the dream to hit that. How can you work with athletes in order to kind of figure out how to get into that flow state, or what is a flow state in your opinion for athletes?
So yeah, that's a great question. Let's do this from the top down. So let's start with two different states according to the literature. One is flow, one is clutch. Okay, here's the difference. Flow feels good, clutch doesn't, until after, if you're clutch, right? But in the moment, okay? So what do we mean by that? What does it feel good? So first, what's creating the potentiality for either one of these states? And they're both what we call emergent states, meaning there is sort of this cascading of events that leads to this emergence of a flow state or a clutch state, right? So like, you know, Joe, you can probably relate. I think we've talked about it before. Like if you start off a game pretty good, you get those first couple of touches are crisp, right? You maybe dice somebody up on the first move, right? You've gotten a shot off early in the game. That starts to create this positive emergence or this cascading effect, right? Now, the very first step before you even get to that point, though, is creating an ideal sort of challenge skill level ratio or scenario. And what we mean specifically is the challenge will ideally exceed the skill level slightly. Okay. And why is that so important? Because to get into a flow state or a clutch state, it should demand everything of you, right? Total immersiveness. So it's got to be the highest possible challenge without being over that mark, because over that mark can create anxiety and the rigidity we talked about earlier, right? So here's how you can think of it. And I think I've seen some reels. I think you have a video component, right? If I just kind of draw with my fingers. Yeah. So those listening, I'm just drawing like an upside down U. It's a normal distribution for stats nerds, right? So what does that mean? So that on one side of this normal distribution, we would have low stress, low challenge, calm, bored. Okay. This is your spring cup games. This is your preseason games, right? This is playing that like non-power 5 that you kick the shit out of. It's just like you can still play well because you're Division I athletes, right? But it's not demanding of you in the way it needs to be. Okay. Now the flip side of that is on the far side of that distribution, it would be anxiety. not just stress, not challenge, but like, ooh, this challenge is here and I perceive it as something I am not capable of meeting or taking on. So that creates fear and nervousness and rigidity. Okay. So that might be, I don't know, like Joe, I thought you girls came out pretty confident, but Sam, 2 years ago, Michigan State traveled down to play Arkansas, and one of my old club players from LA was on the Arkansas team. So I went down for that game. So Arkansas is what? 2, 3-time SEC champs. Like they had been in the SEC tournament finals 4 or 5 years in a row. I think they had made an Elite Eight or two. That was like a big jump, I think, for the program at that time. And I would imagine for some girls, it might have pushed them slightly into that anxiety place, right? But most of them got into the middle of the distribution, which is what we call eustress. Okay. So listen, overly nerdy, but listen to what I'm saying to you. You want peak performance and flow or clutch, it's got to be hard. It's got to be somewhat unpleasant. It's got to be uncomfortable. But that discomfort has to be underpinned with a certain level of optimism or confidence that the challenge is surmountable, right? That's the mindset shift that moves it. And Joe's probably sick of hearing this language, from a threat to a challenge or an opportunity. And that's the distinguishment with a clutch state, right? When you think about clutch athletes, it's not that they don't feel pressure. It's that the pressure is exciting. The pressure is the moment they've been waiting for. The pressure is the opportunity because it's meaningful and they've put so much time and energy and effort into it. It's not something to run away from, fight, flight, or freeze. It's something to embrace, excite, and delight. It's a totally different stress response.
Yeah. This is, I hope every athlete listening to this is like picturing games where it might have, challenged them and pushed them versus those games where you hit that. As an athlete, sometimes it is hard. You have to take a couple touches to get into that place where you do have that level of confidence as well. How can you flip the mindset of seeing that challenging opponent and embracing it as that opportunity to take on pressure versus fearing it? Where's that flip come from?
So let's go back to the initial framework: biopsychosocial, 100% nervous system, top down, bottom up, outside in. So it could be thinking. Case in point, right? Michael Jordyn, infamous for, I'm going to make believe that my opponent across from me just insulted me in some way or disrespected me in some way, right? I'm going to literally bet players on the free throw line that I can make these free throws with my eyes closed. He would do things to manipulate that level of sort of stress, anger. We call it arousal, right? You're going from default, calm, relax mode to action mode, right? And so you want to take those levels of arousal not so far that action mode becomes rigid, right? But not so low that you're still kind of in la-di-da. And so you can do that through how you perceive the opponent, how you can perceive the importance of the game, right? Like people that are self-described gamers, this is a real challenge for you because sometimes that means practices and trainings and working on your own isn't all that interesting. Think Allen Iverson sort of deal, right? But I made the point earlier, it might be biological first, right? It might be that you're confident, but you've gotten yourself so excited and hyped up for this that you've actually taken it a little too far, and you just got to use some parasympathetic breathing to just calm the system a little bit and get yourself dialed into that sweet spot and not just run out and get yourself a yellow card within the first 5 minutes sort of deal, right? It could be outside in. How do your coaches communicate with you? How do your teammates communicate with you? What's your relationship like with the people who influence the way you think and feel? Let's say parents, significant others, right? Partners, those sorts of things. All of those can have an impact on the pregame and during game state as well, right? So I think it all matters.
Absolutely. So can you go into a little bit about what top down and bottom up is? You've mentioned it a few times now, but
Sure. Yeah, to reiterate, it's kind of what we've been talking about. So top down, we say, is thinking about your thinking. So this is perspective taking. This is challenging beliefs. This is searching for what we call thinking traps or thinking errors or biases or cognitive distortions. it's gratitude, it's mindfulness. It is anything that allows you to sort of come outside of your own self or body and look down at you and say, like, how is this entity that is me thinking and processing right now? Right. And can I reach down into this entity that is me and stir the pot a little bit, change things up with different techniques? Bottom up is really body first. And so there's words interoceptive and exteroceptive. Exteroceptive is our awareness and kind of sensing of everything outside of us. Interoceptive is our awareness of and sensations of anything inside of us. This is interoceptive awareness, tuning into somatic sensations, heart rate, sweat, breath rate, right? Tension in the body. But it's also emotional awareness or feelings awareness and intelligence. And then it's just dialing in or optimizing the body. So sleep, energy in, which is nutrition, hydration, energy out, which is movement and exercise, breath work, could be cold exposure, biofeedback, but it's dialing in the vessel that carries the brain, right? Outside in then is the environment, right? The social settings or surroundings. So these are things like meaning, purpose, community, social connection, like just understanding relationships are the single greatest predictor of happiness and well-being and life satisfaction worldwide. It's not anywhere close. Number two is meaning, and meaning is usually a connection to things outside yourself. So what I'm kind of telling you is like the two most important things to your happiness are not fucking you, right? It's other people. Hopefully it's okay to swear on your show, but
All you.
it's a big deal. It's a really, really big deal because we're talking about an underpinning of mental health and well-being and those sorts of things. You got to understand so much of it is about the other people around us.
Yeah, you just mentioned the mental health aspect, and if we've seen it grow and really come to fruition and be a main topic of conversation within the athletic community these past couple years. You've been in the business a long time, and as we see this big push for it and the destigmatization and advocacy for your mental health, how does that conversation evolve and how has it impacted the way you do your job as a sports psychologist?
So I am not by training a sports psychologist. Adam is my partner who directs mental performance for the Washington Nationals. And he also has a master's in mental health counseling, right? And has put in a lot of those hours. So if anything ever comes up, let's say with, an athlete or a program on that end, we've got some people in place who are, better trained and more equipped to handle it than me, right? As a case by case scenario. If you're talking about the larger conversation, what we're trying to do and our place in it, I would say the following. We've been around young people and athletes for decades. We see the change. We understand and sympathize with the change. And we want to help as many athletes and parents and coaches as we possibly can. And not everything is trauma. Not everything is I am anxiety, not I have anxiety. I am an anxious person. Not everything is ADHD. Not everything is depression. And so I want to take all of those seriously. And there is real research around ideas like social or behavioral contagion, where when someone has something, miraculously, it pops up in other people too. Supposedly. So it's not an either or, it's a yes and. I don't want people to misinterpret what we're saying. We take this very seriously, and we should not feel all the time like bricks are just falling on us and that there's nothing to be done. That's what we would call a self-fulfilling prophecy. You're screwing yourself if you take on that attitude. Shit hits the fan. If you're feeling miserable, if you need help, we sympathize, we get it. Get up and do something about it. That's kind of the attitude we're taking, right?
Yeah.
Not disregarding, just trying to empower.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think especially, at least like on my TikTok For You page, I feel like everyone's like self-diagnosing with like the ADHD and things of that nature. I do think there is maybe an over self-diagnosis in these areas as it's becoming more and more popular. So how would you go about an athlete who is like struggling with these thoughts and ideas and maybe trying to self-diagnose, but wants to perform optimally on the soccer field, but is struggling in that area.
Listen, if you're at the point where like, oh, I'm wondering if I need to diagnose.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So first, let me say this. I have a doctoral degree in psychology, right? Many, many years reading research papers and organizing and running studies and now coaching people and helping them learn some of these skills and apply some of these skills. And it is not legal for me, nor would I ever even consider attempting diagnosing somebody with anything. So those thinking about self-diagnosing, check yourself and be a little humble about what you do or do not know. However, I'm never going to discourage someone from trying to better understand what's going on with them, right? So read and research and learn, then go talk to a professional. Come with those questions. Come with those topics. I read this. I've been thinking about that. Do you think this has anything to do? Like, check out the local therapist, see what resources you have on campus, right? Reach out to the mental health hotlines. Like, there's so many different resources out there and available. And just because you're asking questions doesn't mean you necessarily have this super serious problem or you're mentally ill or something like that. But if you're at the point where you're thinking, man, maybe I need to diagnose myself, don't try to diagnose yourself. Ask somebody else that has the training and has seen it time and time again. It's crazy towns.
And I think something that's really important to say too is, in order to go see a sports performance coach or a sports psychologist, you don't have to have a diagnosis. I do not have to be medically ill to do these things. And so I think this is where a lot of the self-diagnosis comes from, is I feel like I have to say I have anxiety to allow myself to go get help. Whereas there's no need. There's no prerequisite to asking for something to help perform better. And I feel like this is something that we kind of get caught up in a lot.
Correct. Totally agree, Sam. Like, kind of coming full circle, it's when we talked about anti-fragility, I said proactive. Learn the skills and the techniques so that when unpleasantness shows up, we can take it in, understand it, leverage it, process it. Because guess what? Life is not intended to be fully pleasant all the time. All of our emotions have utility. Fear keeps you safe. Anger causes you to fight for justice. Like Inside Out's coming out, or Inside Out 2 is coming out soon, right? So they've added 2 or 3 more of the core emotions. They're actually speaking to neuroscience scientists to help write these movies, right? So the original 5, anger, sadness, fear, disgust, and joy, are 5 of, depending on whose model you use, the 7 or 12 core emotions. Right? So joy helps you learn, come back for more. Fear keeps you safe. Anger, like I said, helps you fight for whatever it is. Disgust helps you ward off poison. And who's the hero in Inside Out? Sadness. She helps us process, right? So why do I bring all that up? Just because you feel unpleasant doesn't necessarily mean something is wrong and you need to run and you need to fix it. What you might need to learn to do is develop what we call distress tolerance, sit in it, allow it to be there, understand the point of it or its utility. And then the real empowerment piece is learning to use it and leverage it, right? There's nothing particularly cool or envious about just running from it all the time. So we're trying to be proactive. We're trying to get in and just develop those skills before stuff gets bad. And then here's what I'll say too, is when that stuff hits, the fear, the anxiety, the stress, the pressure, if it lasts forever, we got a problem. That's where you got to talk to somebody. You got to see somebody. Maybe it's a coach, maybe it's a therapist, right? Whatever it might be just some sort of trusted friend or adult. But my point is, like, these things aren't inherently bad. It's about dosage and the amount of time we're experiencing them, right?
Yeah. So when you have these young athletes who want to start taking the mental side of the game super seriously and like getting more into this, what are some things you'd recommend for them to kind of get started?
Yeah, it's a great question. So trying to think of how short I should keep my list, but let's start here. If you want to become better at getting outside yourself and looking at yourself to change behavior. If you want to get better at interoception, tuning into breath and heartbeat and sweat and all those things. And if you want to get better at relationships and connection, you have to, it's a non-negotiable, you have to have the ability to be present moment to moment. And that is the loosey-goosey, sometimes people roll their eyes word, that's mindfulness. It is mindful of that given moment. And so I think a lot of people hear mindfulness, they assume it's the same thing as meditation. Not really, right? Meditation generally is mindfulness, but mindfulness does not have to be meditative. You can mindfully eat your breakfast. You can mindfully drink a cup of coffee, right? You can mindlessly do it, like I do many nights, by eating dinner while I'm watching my sports show and I'm scanning my phone. That's not mindful. That's not present, right? So when it comes to mindfulness, more specifically meditation, as little as like 3 minutes a day for a couple of weeks can start to create a really pronounced change in how alert and attentive you are to individual sensations, thoughts, feelings. And that's got to be the starting point for a lot of people. For a lot of collegiate athletes, I think all Big Ten athletes actually, you actually have free access to the Calm app, which can help you with a lot of those things. And then once you're better at like becoming aware of thoughts and feelings, then it turns into the skills that help you navigate those. And so and I'll give you one or two from each bucket. For top down, that's learning skills to challenge my thoughts. Okay. It doesn't mean your thoughts are always wrong, but think of it this way. It's the equivalency of checking your math in high school. Okay. I'm pretty sure my answer is correct. Okay. And just because I'm checking my math doesn't mean my answer is wrong, but I'm going to check my math anyway, just to make sure I didn't get here accidentally. Right. And so in the brain, I'll give you a simple example. So I've got, a lot of your listeners will know the phrase RBF, not a super nice, affectionate phrase, right? But Joe's heard this joke probably too many times. I have the male version of that. And so I will be sitting sometimes in meetings, and for listeners, RBF is just resting, not very nice B word face to refer to a woman who just kind of looks angry all the time. So I have the male version of that. So why do I bring that up? I could be in meetings, I can be in sessions, I can be with clients, and they might think I'm mad. They might think I'm angry. That all of a sudden might generate nervousness in them. They might then restrict what they say or how they say it. They might change how they engage with me, right? Well, if you learn to challenge beliefs through thinking traps, you might say, hey, am I jumping to conclusions? Oh, yeah, I am. Am I making assumptions? Yeah, I am. Am I mind reading? Yeah, I am. Maybe I'm wrong about all three of these things, and I should just take an effing breath and chill out for a moment, right? Doesn't mean I'm wrong, but sometimes, remember we talked about that distribution, that stress point. Sometimes that's enough to bring us from outside the zone right into where we need to be, right? But it's not always about changing our thoughts. So the second thing I'd say is, and Adam would hammer this home if he were here, acceptance. Not trying to remove or push back or always change unpleasant emotions. Sometimes accepting them and trying to figure out ways to move forward how you want, regardless of how it feels. Easier said than done, but the central premise is one approach, push away negative, feel good, get rid of it. And sometimes that's necessary. Sometimes we need distractions short term, but the healthier, longer term approach is allow that stuff in, feel how it feels, make sense of it, understand its utility, and then move forward how I want to anyway. That's real strength. That's empowerment. Right? For bottom up, sleep. It's got to be sleep hygiene. We spend a third of our lives doing it. If you're not treating it like a job, you're a bonehead. You're just missing all sorts of stuff. I'm sorry. Like, and all due respect to parents who are busy and losing sleep because of that. And I know schedules are busy for high schoolers now, but like it is so critical. A third of our lives is spent in this state if we're doing it pretty well. Got to be a big deal. So sleep like a cave person. Cold as hell, dark as hell. Okay. Obviously, energy in, energy out, paying attention to nutrition, and then outside in. One of the single best ways to manage stress, to manage pressure, to keep well-being levels high, to generally feel good is to do for others. If you're already on a burnout trajectory, maybe you don't have space and time and capacity to do for others. If you're not on that trajectory and you're just looking for some pick-me-ups, go volunteer. Do some acts of kindness. Take care of some other people. The other thing I'll say, and I think this is especially important for young people, and don't misinterpret what I'm going to say, spirituality. I am not saying religion, but I am saying spirituality. Huge protector against suicidality, against depression, against anxiety disorders, spirituality. That might be religion, that might be philosophy, that might be nature, right? In connection to parks. It might, for some people, surfing and extreme sports and flowy activities is extremely spiritual. Like there's a lot of different ways you can access spirituality or transcendence, just belief in and connecting to something other than just your own like individual self, right? There's obviously so much, like Joe, like we've got tons and tons of stuff, but if I tried to boil it down to like one or two things in the top down, bottom up, outside in bucket, that's where my head goes.
Yeah. You mentioned thinking traps, which I think you see a lot, especially within women here, where maybe it's thinking traps with you and another teammate or thinking traps with you and your coaching staff. How do you go about navigating and managing those?
First step, memorize them, know what they are, right? So here's a good pop quiz if I tried to go through the 7 or 8, but you'll see different lists. We can go through at least most of them right now. So I already mentioned, I think 3. So making assumptions, right? Why is that a thinking? So first, let's actually explain what a thinking trap is. So something unpleasant happens. What's the brain inherently, subconsciously often try to do? Fix it. And I don't really want to feel unpleasant. So ideally, my brain will fix it as quickly as possible. And in doing that, I always make this joke, but, growing up in Michigan and before a time of like Waze and Google Maps, my dad would try to take like back roads, quote unquote, shortcuts to a lot of places, right? And, at least a time or two, these were not shortcuts. They were dead ends. They actually made things worse. That's a thinking trap. Okay. It's the brain trying to rush to solve a problem, right? Oh, I'm in a meeting with Nick and he looks kind of pissy, right? So what's my brain do? Makes an assumption. Oh my God, he's mad at me. Jump to conclusions. Oh, what did I say earlier that might have made him mad, right? Externalize. Oh man, like Nick's really being a jackass today. Like I got to deal with him again. Personalize. Oh, I really screwed something up. It's always my fault. I always do this, right? Jump to conclusion. I think I already said jump to conclusions. What am I missing? Oh, tunnel vision, right? Missing out on the rest of the meeting because I can't stop looking at Nick and wondering what he's thinking, right? Selective perception, we'd call that. So all of these are attempts to try to address that problem and make sense of it. So how do you deal with it? Know what that list is, and then just kind of ask yourself, like, am I making an assumption? Yeah. Are there other possible like realities here? Yeah. Like Nick just looks how he looks. It has absolutely nothing to do with me whatsoever. He might not even be upset. He might just be tired. He might just look that way. He might just have a pissy face. Right. And so that's what I said earlier about challenging beliefs is sometimes just ask the question. And if you want to take it a step beyond the question, challenging is about presenting contradictory evidence. Okay. Oh, there is this evidence. Yeah, Nick does look a little angry, but I have all this other evidence that suggests it could just be these other things. And if I weigh all the evidence side by side, the reality is I just don't know.
So one of the biggest questions that I feel like Jordyn and I get asked, and there's obviously so many layers to this, is, hey, I'm a 14-year-old soccer player, or I'm the mom of a 14-year-old girl, and my daughter has zero confidence on the field. How do I get more confidence? As if it's this like overnight thing. What's your biggest advice for someone who's just really just struggling with confidence and everything like that on the field?
Yeah, this is an interesting one and a tricky one. The first thing I'm going to say is I don't know that confidence is that important. I actually am not. I know it's not necessary to perform at a peak level. So remember what I said about clutch state. right? Clutch is I've had a shitty game up to this point, but I'm taking the final shot anyway, right? And I might not be confident based on how I played, but I'm optimistic and I trust my process and I know I put in the work and this is an opportunity and I'm going for it anyway. It's not the same thing as confidence. Okay. Why do I also bring that up? In my opinion, confidence better be somewhat evidence-based. If it's not, then it's arrogance. Okay. So why do I bring that up? If we're struggling with confidence, the first thing I'll do with a parent or athlete is look for the evidence. Okay. So let's take it away from sports for a second. I have this longtime client I absolutely adore. She is an effing badass. Aerospace entrepreneur, built a company into what, 8 figures, I think, maybe even 9 figures, like huge name in a field that is largely male dominated. I just think she's awesome, like brilliant, single mom, like doing all sorts of crazy stuff. And a lot of times the confidence isn't there. And even when you point out the evidence, the confidence or the efficacy still isn't there. And I would say sometimes that's beyond my expertise. Sometimes that's old, that's subconscious, that's something that maybe needs to be thought about, addressed, discussed via, therapeutic approaches and those sorts of things. But beyond that, which people listening aren't going to have the expertise for, or, before we even get to that point, I think it just comes down to looking for the evidence, right? When did I have the last good game, the last good training? Even in the last game, right? Am I doing the negativity bias? Am I lacking confidence because I just keep thinking about those couple of touches that I missed, right? And coaches are always like infamous for this. I think even some coaches we know do this a little bit, but when they say better touch, right? Like, no shit, Sherlock. Like, I didn't mean to have that touch, right? Like those sorts of things. And I'm just so focused on that when the reality is there was another, whatever I played 55, 60 minutes of that match and probably another 15 touches that were fine. Right. And I need to pay attention to that evidence, not be overly focused on the negative, not the inattentional blindness or tunnel vision, like I talked about earlier, not looking over to the sideline and wondering if Dave or Jeff are mad at me because I had the bad touch and jumping to conclusions and mind reading and making assumptions. Right. And so you can see how these things kind of layer onto each other. A lot of it is that inner dialogue, that top down, that story I tell myself and those checks and balances I have in place. Ultimately, though, confidence is going to come from repeated successes. So if you don't have repeated successes, evidence of repeated successes, and you have confidence, you got a problem. You're arrogant, unearned, right? The flip side is also true. If you have a lot of successes, right, but that your confidence is still pretty low, there's probably something else going on there that we might want to dig into a little bit more deeply. But in between, look for the evidence. If you're just struggling with confidence, go back to your best games, go back to your best, times, go back to some of your highest heights, make sure you're combating that negativity bias, make sure you're not falling into these thinking traps, right? See what that does.
Something I found really interesting, and you talked about how the negative was more sticky earlier.
Mm-hmm.
I believe it was the Losada zone is what it's called. Maybe that's something else, but
Debunked the Losada zone. So let's get into it real quick because I do think it still has some interesting implications, let's say. Okay, so here's the idea. Losada zone suggested through mathematical modeling, and this comes out of some of the research from Barbara Fredrickson, who was at that other school in Ann Arbor for when she did this research, and then is now at UNC Chapel Hill. Brilliant researcher. So the idea from the initial theory, broaden and build, is that when we experience pleasant emotion, it broadens our vision. And through that broadening of our vision, we take on more things, and taking on more things builds up our resources. Okay. So case in point, you both at some point showed up to a soccer practice, right? When you're 4 or 5, 6 years old, whatever it might be, maybe later. You were probably naturally pretty good. So, oh, well, that gives me pride. That gives me joy. That gives me interest. And so I'm going to come back to it. And because I've come back to it, I started learning to work hard and be disciplined and train outside. I started building up friendships and understanding how to interact with other human beings and the social dynamics of being a female athlete. That's broaden and build, basically, right? So then from that, partner that she wrote this paper with, I can't remember his first name, but Losada put together some mathematical modeling that tried to identify a ratio. Is the ideal team or one-on-one interaction what part negative to what part positive? And the argument was made that the minimum ratio would be 3 parts negative to every 1 part, 3 parts positive, to every 1 part negative, but the ideal was 6-1. Okay. So later on, researchers take a look at this. They push back on the math. The math is way above my level. And basically, my understanding is they published a paper suggesting that these mathematical models were wrong and that you couldn't get it down to like that specific ratio. And then Losada never took up the potential reprint or retraction, which in the academic world, that's not saying it's not right, but it's certainly not backing up your initial argument. So here's your question though, Joe. Setting that aside, acknowledging that as problematic, is there a ratio? And what I want you to hear is, yes, because of the negativity bias, I think there's a ratio. Yes, it should typically be tipped towards the pleasant because of that negativity bias and because that broadens and builds and creates all good things. But here's a good way to start to kind of come full circle and wrap as well. The ratio is not 3-0, 4-0, 5-0. It's 3-1 or 4-1 or 5-1. The one has to be there. Psychological richness. There is a place and utility for unpleasantness. But think about those ratios.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the application for that would be like, teammates having to kind of tell you the hard truth, being able to accept, criticism in that way. And then obviously from a coaching staff as well, and acknowledging that everyone may have a different ratio, being able to apply that and knowing kind of where your teammates lie, if it's closer to the 6-1 or if it's closer to the 3-1, and being able to acknowledge that and help them out in that way. I thought that was really interesting when you talked about it. I didn't know it was debunked though.
Yeah. More or less. So, yeah.
All right. Well, we really appreciate you coming on and sharing all of your knowledge. If there's one thing you want our listeners to kind of take away, one piece of advice to leave them with, what would that be?
Environment and circumstances matter, but they don't determine your entire outcomes in life. We have a lot more power and control than maybe you know about. And so if it comes to how you feel or how you navigate hard stuff or how you're performing in the classroom, outside of the classroom, in relationships, whatever, there's a lot of tools, there's a lot of knowledge, there's a lot of mechanisms coming from real high-end research, more than just, the TikTok universe and whatnot. And a lot of it is out there for free. We've got lots of resources that are available to you for free as well, outside of the sort of programming that, Joe, you and the program have gone through for a few years now. And you can find any of that at our website. It's just the anti-fragile-academy.com.
That's amazing. And that's one thing I want to say. I know even myself got a ton out of this podcast of talking about some of these. So
Good.
Knowing that our listeners definitely did as well, where can people, stay up to date with you? I know you have a podcast. How can people keep this education from you and everything that you guys do?
Sure. Yeah, we'll be on the website. And so the website is going to have our assessment for anti-fragility. So people like getting scores, you can check that out, get the report. There's a bunch of additional resources, even some videos. We're starting to push out a podcast and a YouTube channel now as well. Lots of resources there. But then you also can find us directly on social. Really at this point, just Instagram, starting to build that out and put some free materials out along with the newsletter. And then we've got a pretty good presence on LinkedIn as well. So really any of those locations, or you can always get in touch with us via email at info@theantifragileacademy.
All right, everyone, be sure to go check that out. Thank you so much, Dr. Nick Holton, for coming on and sharing all this with us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
I think sports psychology and just the mental performance aspect of the game is something that is talked about more and more, these days. And it's something that's really integrated with it. My favorite part was when he said the 90-10. It's actually 100% nervous system. And it's something that I think is really important because when you think about it and you separate the mental to the physical, things get lost there. right? But when you're thinking about how it's all encompassing, like you are a player. It's all of you that goes into your performance on the field was really powerful. And there's just so much to be learned. I think it was a great episode. And I could talk for hours with him, just asking questions and picking his brain about all the different ways to improve your game in terms of the mental aspect of it. So really appreciate him coming on and sharing some of that.
You know, what I really think I appreciate most from this interview is just his no BS approach and saying some things that may not be as comfortable or as normal to hear. You know, there are moments where negatives are good. There are moments where we do need to learn from our mistakes and focus on them. Of course, not every night before we go to bed, but you do need to acknowledge those things and how we can grow our game. And I think the way that he speaks about these things are so well put. I know, like, it makes me want to go pick up like 4 books about the topic. So I hope that our listeners got the same amount of information and same amount of like empoweredness that I just did from that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for coming on. And as always, soccer on.
Bye, guys.